How do I add a background to a painting that doesn't distract or take away from the main subject? That is the question I plan to answer in this video. Have you ever added a background to a watercolor painting only to have that background seem to degrade or even ruin the painting? I'll admit, I have had that experience. Some of my students have even told me they are afraid to add a background to their paintings for fear of ruining their work. So in this video, I intend to provide an approach to backgrounds that can replace fear with confidence. As I paint, I will let you into my thinking process. I will point out common problems and share a few tips for creating loose and expressive backgrounds that don't steal the show, but rather support the main subject. I recently painted this watercolor of a beagle. I painted it as a live demo for a class. And to keep the lesson simple, we just focused on the dog. We didn't paint the background. Here's what the painting looked like at the end of the lesson. But this painting clearly needs a background. Here is the finished painting with the background added. I think you can see that by creating an environment or a setting for the dog, the painting has been improved. Previously, the dog was just kind of floating in empty space, but now the dog is situated in a world. The painting has definitely been improved. As I set out to add a background, my goals were to create a loose, impressionist scene that hints at the surroundings and gives the dog a sense of location but doesn't distract or take away from the main subject. I have learned that detailed backgrounds distract, but simple backgrounds support. To do this, I avoided adding lots of details. I kept the washes thin and avoided strong contrast of value. I kept the edges soft and diffused, especially in the middle and distant background. Here is the reference image I was painting from. I used it for inspiration, but as you can see, I also used a lot of artistic license and some imagination to create the scene. You will see as I proceed through the painting process, I utilized a variety of watercolor techniques. I painted wet on wet and wet on dry. I used lifting in the clouds and charging in several areas. I used dry brush to create texture and interest, especially in the midground. Finally, in the foreground, I used scratching to add grasses, and I used opaque gouache to add light details. I guess you could say this painting is kind of like an encyclopedia of watercolor techniques. I think I used them all. So if adding backgrounds to your watercolor paintings is something you need help with, I encourage you to keep on watching. As I get started, the first thing I want to do is take a good look at the reference image. I have it here on my tablet. I want to decide what colors I need to mix up for the background. I'm looking at the orange and I'm thinking I like to use complementary colors quite often if I can. I've got this nice orange on the dog, so the blue there above his head in an open sky I think would work quite well since orange and blue are complementary colors. Of course, the grass is also a kind of green color, which just makes sense. So I'll have blue in the sky and a green grassy field that the dog is standing in. I'm going to simplify the background, as I said in my introduction, because I want a very loose, impressionistic background that doesn't grab attention from the dog. And so I'm not going to have a lot of details. I'm going to keep it loose and a lot of soft edges, things like that. So the first thing I'm doing is mixing up my blue. I'm using cobalt blue here primarily for my background for the sky. And then I'm going to, as you see here next, I'm going to start mixing up some greens and some very neutralized grade greens, bluish greens, to use in the tree line right below the sky. Now I've grabbed my mechanical pencil and I'm going to put in the horizon line. It's really important in any landscape painting that you always establish your horizon line. And so I'm making sure that comes right across behind the dog, and I'm making sure that it's level. The next thing I'm going to do is take a very wet brush, a loose synthetic squirrel hair brush. It's a Princeton Neptune. filled with water. I'm wetting the paper from the top of the paper down to the horizon line. I've decided, as I mentioned earlier, that I want a very soft sky, not with a lot of hard edges and things like that. And so one of the best ways to get soft shapes and soft edges, fuzzy edges, is to put a lot of water on the paper. And by wetting the paper first, you're going to achieve softer edges. I'm taking now my cobalt blue that I've mixed up for the sky, and I'm applying it to the sky. And I'm bringing it right down to the horizon line. I do have my paper here, which is 100% cotton paper. I have it at about a 30-degree angle. You can see the angle of the paper, and the gravity that's introduced is causing the paint to just slowly move down towards the horizon line. It's creating a bit of a bead there right at the horizon. And I'm just going to let the paint kind of do what it wants to do. It wants to flow down. It's mingling. It's creating very soft gradients of changes of color. The sky is usually not all one solid blue color. There's variations of tone and shade in the sky. And so I'm just kind of letting the paint flow down the paper there a bit. Come back with a little bit of darker color near the top. Skies are typically a darker value, higher up in the sky, and then as you move towards the horizon line, sky gets lighter. I've also taken a bit of that neutral tint in blue, the grayish color I mixed there, and as you see, I went ahead and put some darker areas into the sky as well. What I'm envisioning here is that there are some clouds in the sky, and typically underneath the clouds it's going to be darker because it's blocking the light from the sun. And so I will put vertical lines of shadow, kind of the underside of the clouds. I'm doing that here in a couple of places. And then in a moment, I'm going to come and I'm going to take a very clean and damp brush, and I'm going to lift above that some of the blue paint to create the white of the cloud. And this is a really effective and pretty simple way to create a realistic sky with clouds. And you can see how I'm doing that here. The next step is to bring in that line of trees that are right at the horizon line. So I've mixed up a neutralized green. It's a grayish green. I'm using my Princeton Aqua Elite Quill number 6, one of my favorite brushes. Very nice fine point on it. And because the sky is still wet, I'm doing what's called charging in. The colors here that I'm placing right along the horizon line are of a different color and a different value than the sky. But because I'm applying this paint right at the edge of the bead of the blue sky, these colors are charging in or moving into the wet areas of the sky. And the colors are then blending and fusing with the colors of the sky, creating a very soft, diffused tree line at the horizon line. Again, one of my goals here is to create an impression of a landscape without too much detail. I don't want the background to steal attention from the dog. But I do want to get a sense of the foliage in the distant background. And by painting now, charging in a color into a wet area, I get a nice soft line of trees. Now below the horizon line, the paper is dry. So the area I'm painting in now is dry paper, and so I'm painting wet into dry. Whereas with the sky, it was wet into wet. I had wet that paper ahead of time. And but now I want to be able to create a little bit more texture in the middle ground here and in the grass. And so by taking the side of the brush and moving it quickly across the surface of the paper, which is a cold press paper, so it has a slight texture, I'm getting a bit of a dry brush effect. I'm letting a little bits of the paper just shine through, of the white of the paper to shine through the paint. I'm not completely covering the surface of the paper. And again, that's called a dry brush effect. It's not a real strong dry brush effect. My paint is pretty wet at this point, so it's mostly covering the paper. But if I move the brush quick enough, I can get kind of a spackled look to the paint. As I move further down the paper towards the foreground, I want to change the color a bit. I've went from a cooler green there in the middle ground, and I'm going into a much more spring green, golden green in the foreground. This is typical in landscapes, that as you move towards the foreground, the colors tend to get warmer, whereas when colors further away are typically cooler due to atmospheric perspective, to the fact that things further away, there's more air between us and those things, more particles in the air, and so things further away tend to be a cooler color and be more blue. And so I've tried to get that sense here by making my colors in the foreground a little warmer. And my goal here, this is considered the first wash of the background. And I have not let the paper dry completely yet at this point. I'm doing everything from the top of the paper to the bottom, from the sky to the foreground, all in this one wash. Again, the sky, I did that by pre-wetting the paper, but the rest of the background I was painting wet into dry. Now, one thing I've noticed here is that the foreground is a little bit darker here, right in the very foreground, and that's due to the fact that there's some shadow from the dog and other things in the foreground, and so I've darkened that a bit. Now next, I want to introduce a little bit more texture in the middle ground area, just to create more interest. When you have just these large areas of green grass, they look a little overwhelming, like you need a little bit of texture to be introduced. And so I'm just going to do what I call a little dry brush. I've mixed up some fairly dry mixture of different greens. Doesn't have a lot of water in it. And I'm taking a brush and I'm just quickly moving it across the paper, and it's skipping across the paper and leaving a little bit of the other colors to shine through. Now, what I'm doing right now is I am using a spray bottle. The spray bottle is a little bit off camera, so you can't see it, but you see I'm holding my hand up there to try to protect some areas of the painting where I don't want the spray to go, and then spraying in certain areas. What I'm trying to do is just spray add a little water to the grass areas. And the reason for that is because I want to introduce some scratching. And in order to do that effectively, the paint on the paper needs to be just at the right level of wetness. You don't want it to be too wet, because if it is, then when you scratch, the paint will just flow right back into the areas that you've scratched, and you won't see any mark. So I tested a little bit, but I discovered, no, it's a little too wet yet. I added the spray water because it needs to be somewhat wet to be able to lift the paint. But if it's too wet, it really won't work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just let it dry a little bit. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to introduce some scratches. And these scratches will make it look like the grass that's in the foreground. Okay, I've waited a few minutes and the paint has started to dry a bit. It's moist, but it's not real wet. And you can see now I'm able, when I scratch with my fingernail, I'm able to introduce these white lines that really work well as grass. You can see here. Much more effective really than trying to paint over the area, maybe with gouache or something, and creating all these lines of grass doesn't work real well. But taking your fingernail, and again, at just the right time, when the paint is still moist but not real wet, you can scratch and put in grass. This is a great technique and one I really encourage you to experiment with. Again, you have to understand the right timing to get this to work. I'm taking my finger and making even other little small marks all around in this foreground area. Now I've mixed up a few more colors for the middle ground, foreground area, some more greens, just a variety of colors. I've got the brush, I'm holding it at an angle. I'm using the side of the brush again to apply some dry brush technique. And this is allowing me to get a little more texture and interest in these areas of the painting. I'm getting close to being done with the background, but as I take a closer look at it here, and I look at the reference image, there are some lighter pieces of grass and little flowers and things like that that are in the very foreground, coming up and even covering part of the dog there. So I'm just going to work a bit more on that. I think that I want to just get a sense for the grass that comes up and kind of is in front of the dog there. So I'm mixing up some darker green, putting in some grasses there. I'm using darker colors on the lighter part of the dog, since with that light fur in the background, it's going to need a darker color to show up. But in order to paint over the darker part of the dog there on his shoulder, I'm going to need lighter paint. So I've taken my gouache, which is an opaque water-based paint, a little bit different than watercolor, but it's because it's opaque instead of transparent. And I've taken that, just dipped my brush right into the tube of paint and then mixed it on the palette with some of the yellow and greenish colors there. And I'm just painting in these small little flowers that are in the foreground. I'm also using a liner brush here really to put in just lines of grass. Again, where there is already dark color, like the dark green of the grass or the dark areas of the dog, the only way to introduce lighter colors at this point, since the paper is covered up, would be to bring in some opaque paint. And so I'm not opposed to doing that, using a little bit of gouache. It's a slightly different medium, but it is a water-based paint, and it works just great for this kind of application. It's important to move about the painting a lot. Don't just put in evenly spaced pieces of grass or flowers and that kind of thing. You want to kind of make them uneven in terms of their placement and height and length of line and things like that, so that they look more organic and more natural. All right, let's take a closer look at the painting at this point. The foreground grasses here, by using an opaque paint with different colors, yellow and greenish colors, I'm painting over the dog. It really now looks like these flowers and grasses are in the foreground, and they're again giving a sense of place to the dog. The dog is in this field, and there's a foreground, middle ground, and background. The scratching there for the grass looks great. I've got some dry brush in the middle ground. You can see that here. And then up in the sky, the areas where I lifted the clouds, put in some darker shadows under the clouds. I really like the look of that. Again, it's a loose, impressionist kind of background, not lots of detail, a little bit more abstract in areas. But by doing this and using these techniques, I've created a background that really gives a sense of place and location and setting for the dog. The dog doesn't look like he's just floating in space. But this background is done in such a way that it's not distracting. It's not overly detailed. It's not pulling the focus away from the dog, but instead it's supporting the subject matter of the dog and giving the dog a sense of space. So there you go. There's the finished painting of the dog with an impressionist loose background painted in watercolor. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this tutorial to be helpful. If you've gained value, I encourage you to hit the like button, share the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done so. You might want to know I also have a growing list of free and premium watercolor resources on my website at studio.krisdebruine.com. I encourage you to follow the links in the video description. Have a great day, keep on painting, and keep on growing in watercolor.